Good afternoon. I think we'll make a start. My name is Jeff Michaels, and I'm the IEN Senior Fellow at eBay. I'd like to welcome all of you to eBay's seminar series on U.S. foreign policy, and the first of the seminars for this semester. The series is part of a joint initiative of eBay and the Barcelona Institute of North American Studies that aims to promote discussion of U.S. foreign policy related topics by inviting scholars from the social sciences and humanities, as well as practitioners, to share their research and provide their insights. This evening, it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Professor Roseanne McManus from Penn State University, who will be speaking about American deterrence signaling. And there are three reasons why I'm especially pleased that Professor McManus is here and speaking on the subject. The first is that it's a very relevant and timely subject, indeed, perhaps a bit too relevant and timely. We seem to be living in a period of history where the United States seems to be conveying quite a few deterrent threats, both publicly and privately, in relation to the war in Ukraine, but not exclusively about the war or in relation to Russia for that matter. And I'm afraid I've not actually counted the number of deterrence-related threats, at least those that have been issued publicly, nor have I compared what we're seeing now to, say, the number of threats that the US issued a year ago or 5 years ago or something like that. But it just seems like this is a period of an unusual amount of activity, not unsurprisingly given the war. By coincidence, we've also recently had the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which provided a very timely reminder of another dangerous period in which various threats were issued. And I'm not sure if it sort of was good timing or bad timing, but to be in the middle of one crisis in which nuclear threats have been very much part of the discussion, and then to have this coincide with the anniversary of a previous nuclear crisis basically ensures that the analogy is going to be quite prominent. The second reason I'm happy Professor McManus is here today is that I can think of few scholars better qualified to discuss American deterrence signaling and to place what we're seeing today into a broader context, not only in terms of sort of the historical context and referring to other previous cases, but also in terms of how effective or not these signals actually are and what sort of factors account for them being effective or not. In addition to the talk she'll be giving shortly, I can highly recommend her 2017 book, Statements of Resolve, Achieving Coercive Credibility in International Conflict, published by Cambridge University Press. She's also published numerous other journal articles on the topic, including in Security Studies, the British Journal of Political Science, International Interactions, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, the Journal of Peace Research, and International Organization. And the third reason I'm delighted she's here today is that she's actually a former colleague of mine from about 17 or 18 years ago, when we were both working as analysts for the US Defense Department. And I think it was sometime in the last year, I randomly came across one of her journal articles, sort of did a double take when I saw her name, then looked up her university page, and sure enough, it was the same Rosemary McManus that I previously worked with. I was very glad to see she had not only managed to escape the sub-basement of the Pentagon, but then went on to get a Ph.D. and began working as an academic in the international security field, specializing, among other topics, in the subject of her talk this afternoon. So Rosemary, welcome, and very good to see you again, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you for the invitation to speak. It's really an honor to be here virtually with you all, and thank you everyone for coming. So as Jeff said, the topic of the presentation will be American deterrence signaling, and I'm just going to start out with some definitions just to cover how political scientists think about signaling, what we mean by it, what are the different types of signals, what makes them effective. Then I'll talk a little bit about Cold War deterrence signaling. That's obviously a huge topic, so I'm not going to cover all or even most of it, but I'll focus on deterring a Soviet invasion of NATO, which was sort of the biggest deterrence problem. And then I'll talk about a couple of the most prominent contemporary deterrence problems, Ukraine and Taiwan, and how the US has tried to signal in those cases. So deterrence is persuading your opponent not to take an action against your interests, usually an action that you would otherwise expect they would want to take, And you do that by threatening punishment. Often the punishment is use of force. In fact, that's most commonly the case when we think about international conflict situations, but it could be some other type of punishment. It could be, for example, a threat of sanctions. And deterrence is not only something that happens in international relations. I sometimes, when I teach my undergraduates about it, I say, like, I'm on my syllabus, I threaten to check your papers for plagiarism with this electronic software. When you plagiarized, I'm going to report you to this disciplinary office. So that is also an example of a deterrent threat. I want to prevent them from plagiarizing by threatening disciplinary action. If you have to carry out the threat, deterrence has failed. So the reason you make a deterrence threat is that you don't actually want to fight. You prefer not to fight. And so if the other side still does what you tell them not to, and you have to fight, then that's considered a deterrence failure. So when you make a deterrence threat, you don't really want to carry it out. So I, for example, don't really want to have to report my students to this disciplinary office. And the US didn't really want to fight the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Related to that point, carrying out a threat is often painful for both sides. So university disciplinary proceedings are painful for both me and the students. War would be painful for both the US and Russia. And so if carrying out the threat is painful not only for your adversary, but for you, then that can create a barrier to credibility. We can break down deterrence in a couple of different ways. One is between immediate and general deterrence. Immediate deterrence is deterring an adversary from taking a particular action after a crisis has already begun. So, for example, I'm not going to really talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis today, which I think is good because Jeff said there's going to be another presentation about that. But in a crisis like that, if you're trying to deter further escalation, then that would be an example of immediate deterrence. General deterrence is deterring the initiation of crises, or it could also be framed as deterring challenges that could lead to crises in a peacetime situation. That's probably easier to accomplish because the other side doesn't have to visibly back down. If you're already in a crisis and you're trying to deter escalation, then one side has to sort of back down. But with general deterrence, it's already peaceful. And so if it just stays peaceful, then deterrence has succeeded. So that's easier to accomplish, but it can also be harder to observe success because we don't always know if the other side really wanted to start trouble. Maybe they were just contented with peace as well. And I'll come back to that issue when I talk about the Cold War. Another way that we can break down deterrence, which is even more relevant for our discussion today, is direct versus extended deterrence. So direct deterrence is deterring an attack against the homeland. So for the United States, direct deterrence would be deterring an attack against the United States. Extended deterrence is deterring an attack on an ally or some other challenge to a lesser interest. So the most relevant one during the Cold War, and even also still relevant today, given what's going on between the US and Russia, is deterring an attack on NATO. But it could also include deterring an attack on any other type of US ally, or even just general challenges to American interests. There tends to be a greater credibility barrier to extended deterrence because it's easy to believe that any country will fight if it's directly attacked. I mean, that's just sort of like basic instinct, basic self-defense. But you might be less eager to fight on behalf of an ally, especially if fighting is very costly. So during the Cold War, people, and I'll circle back to this in a minute, when I talk specifically about Europe during the Cold War, people often wondered, would the US trade New York for Berlin? So would we be willing to get involved in a nuclear war that could end up destroying New York City and lots of other cities in order to defend the people of West Berlin? So how can we overcome this credibility barrier? So credibility is a necessary condition for deterrence success. So if the other side doesn't believe you'll carry out a threat, then they really are not going to be motivated to comply with your threat. So like if Russia didn't believe the US would impose sanctions if they invaded Ukraine, then the US threat of sanctions wouldn't really influence their decision. So credibility is a necessary condition. On the other hand, it's not necessarily a sufficient condition because there are some countries that might be so aggressive that they would be willing to fight. And so even if they know that you'll fight or impose some other punishment, so even if the threat of punishment is credible, they would still be aggressive or resolved enough to fight you anyway. So there's two main pathways to credibility that political scientists study. One is reputation based on past behavior. So that's the idea that we have to be tough and fight today. And then that's the only way other people will believe we'll fight in the future. That's not going to be the focus of this presentation, though. If you have questions about it, we can circle back to it in the Q&A. But instead, in this presentation, I'm going to focus on signaling. So signals are basically just statements or gestures intended to send a message. And in the case of deterrence, the message is generally that the signaler is willing to carry out the punishment, that they're resolved to carry it out. Signals are more likely to be effective if they're costly. And that's because the cost can distinguish those who are resolved to carry out the punishment from those who are not. So the thinking is if you are not resolved enough to fight or impose some other costly punishment, then you're also less likely to be resolved enough to bear the cost of sending a costly signal. And so those who are more likely to fight or punish are more likely to send the costly signal. Those who are less likely to fight or punish are less likely to send the costly signal. And so the signal can sort of help separate between the types. So there's two ways that a signal, or two main ways that political scientists have identified that a signal can be costly. So the first is sunk costs. This means a cost that is paid immediately when the signal is sent and cannot be recouped. So that's what it means to be sunk. You can't get it back. In theory, game theorists tell us that the nature of the signal shouldn't really matter in theory. So you could, in theory, simply set fire to a big pile of money. I mean, you'd have to explain why you were doing it, but Biden could say, "I'm resolved to punish Russia if it invades Ukraine," and like set fire to a big pile of money or something. But in practice, that would be really weird, and no one ever does that. In practice, these signals are usually military in nature. Troop deployments, arms transfers, military exercises, shows of force. And some of these actually can serve a double purpose. So they do sink a cost, which shows resolve, but they can also help to prepare you to fight. The other type of cost, which I'm actually going to give even more examples of when I get to concrete examples, is hand tying costs. So these are costs that deliberately limit your own ability to back down. And so in these cases, the cost is paid after you send the signal. So it's not necessarily costly to send the signal itself, but afterward, if you were to try to back down, you would find it is more costly or even impossible to back down. So some signals simply make it difficult to back down. A good example of this would be threatening public statements. So if you make a statement in public, committing to do something like fight to protect Taiwan, and then China does invade Taiwan and you don't fight, then you're going to look kind of bad, both to your own population and to the international community. So making a statement like that makes it harder to back down, although not impossible. There are some hand-tying signals that might even make it impossible to back down and therefore make war automatic. One example would be burning a bridge behind you. So if you have like a body of water at your back and there's another army in front of you, if you burn the bridge behind you, then you have no choice but to fight. And that's kind of a stylized example, but when I talk about the Cold War, I'll give a couple of examples that are more like actually happened in recent history. One interesting thing about hand-tying signals is that they both show and increase your resolve. So like the sunk cost signals, they show your resolve because someone who was not committed to fight or carry out some other punishment would be less likely to make a hand-tying signal, but they can also actually increase your resolve. So you should be more willing to fight after having made a statement that you're willing to fight, because now backing down is more costly for you. So by making these signals, you can sort of change your own utility for backing down. Or even, again, make backing down impossible. So if you burn a bridge behind you, then you've just dramatically increased your resolve because you literally have no option except to fight the army in front of you. So turning to the Cold War is very major event. 70 years of world history. So obviously I can't cover it all, but I thought I would just focus on sort of the most key and the most persistent deterrence problem in the Cold War, which was deterring a Soviet invasion of Europe. So an attack against NATO. And nuclear deterrence was crucial to this strategy. So the Soviet army was very large, and of course the Soviet Union was located in Europe as well as Asia, so it was easy for them to have a large army in the vicinity of NATO. For the US, it was more costly to send troops abroad, so, and even for other NATO members, there wasn't necessarily a big appetite to maintain really large standing militaries. And so NATO didn't really maintain a large enough conventional fighting force to hold the Soviets off. And instead, NATO relied on the threat of nuclear first use. Now, this policy evolved a little bit during the Cold War. In the early Cold War, when the US had a greater nuclear advantage, the idea was we would just use nuclear weapons immediately. Over time, it evolved into a strategy of a flexible response, where first we would try to fight conventionally and only use nuclear weapons if it became necessary. But again, we didn't really have a big enough conventional fighting force to be certain we could win conventionally. And so the nuclear threat still was the main thing underlying US deterrence. The trouble was, though, that both sides had very big nuclear arsenals, and they both had a secure second strike. So neither could disarm the other with their first strike, which created a situation of mutually assured destruction, meaning that both sides would be devastated in nuclear war. And this was obviously an obstacle to US threat credibility. That takes us back to what I said earlier about, would the US trade New York for Berlin? So would the US actually fight to defend West Berlin, West Germany, France, Spain, if it knew that fighting would actually lead to its own destruction? And the answer to that, many people might think, is no. I mean, as much as we care about Europe, we would probably rather have the United States, remain in existence rather than be totally destroyed, as well as Europe and the rest of the world also probably being destroyed in a nuclear war. So this was an obstacle to threat credibility. But sort of the twist or the irony is that if the US could make the threat to use nuclear weapons credible enough, then it would arguably never have to carry it out. Because if the US threat is really credible, then the Soviets will be deterred from invading, and then the US will never actually have to carry out this extremely horrible threat. So the US did a variety of things to try to make the threat really credible. So one was the NATO alliance. And this is maybe the weakest one, but by writing the alliance down and giving it legal weight, the US would have incurred some reputational costs if it had just abandoned NATO to the Soviets. The US also sent troops to Europe. Now this is a sunk cost as well as a hand-tying cost. So it's sunk in the sense that sending the troops cost money. But there's also a hand-tying cost, because if the troops are like right there in the way of the Soviets, then it's going to become pretty much automatic that they'll fight. And again, there wasn't necessarily enough of them to win the fight, but it's been proposed that if they had fought and died, then that would galvanize US public opinion, and the US public would demand more action and would be more willing to support a nuclear war. So it increases the odds of escalation to the nuclear level. And then an even more sort of automatic way of trying to make the war go nuclear was deploying tactical nuclear weapons. So these are nuclear weapons that are intended to be used on the battlefield rather than to do strategic destruction of the adversary. And so these weapons were deployed to Europe, and they were given to field commanders. At some point, they were even given to allied countries. So they're technically US nuclear weapons, but non-US NATO troops were handling them. And there was pre-delegated authority to use them in a battle situation. And so the idea was that these guys on the ground would be much more motivated to use nuclear weapons than the president in DC, who would be removed from the war, who would be sort of like removed in like a psychological sense. The war would seem much more distant to the president than to these troops on the ground. And so having these tactical nuclear weapons in Europe made escalation to the nuclear level almost automatic. And then quite possibly, if they were used at the tactical level, it would have escalated to the strategic level as well, which would lead to this mutually assured destruction. So did this work? Well, it's kind of hard to say. I mean, it clearly didn't fail. The Soviets never attacked NATO. So in that sense, it worked. But like I said, it's hard to know if general deterrence is actually working, because you can't really observe what the other side wanted to do. So it's possible the Soviets, especially post-Stalin, were fairly contented with the status quo and simply didn't want to attack. All right, so moving along to the current day, so Ukraine. So in early 2022, it was becoming apparent that Russia was threatening to invade Ukraine. So this was what we would call an immediate deterrence situation, because there was a crisis, as well as extended deterrence. And the US attempted to deter Russia by threatening things like severe sanctions, swift and severe costs, and a steep price if Russia invaded Ukraine. So these are all somewhat vague threats, although they do suggest a clear likelihood of economic sanctions, just not very specific. At the same time, the US, Biden explicitly said that the US would not use force, which could be seen as a little controversial because some people might say, well, it's better to remain ambiguous, keep the Russians guessing. But his goal might have been, in addition to like sort of reassuring the US population that he wasn't going to take us into war, this might also help with the goal of establishing a reputation for honesty. So the idea is, you can think about two types of reputation. Like a reputation for resolve means you're like always willing to fight. But a reputation for honesty means you fight when you'll say you'll fight. And so to establish that type of reputation, if you're not planning to fight, you should be clear about that. And then in the future, if you are planning to fight, people are more likely to believe you when you say that. But anyway, the threat, these sort of vague sanction threats did not deter Russia. So Russia invaded, so US deterrence failed. However, oh, okay, I forgot about this slide. So why did US deterrence fail? Well, there seemed to be sort of a credibility problem. The US mentioned sanctions, but Russia didn't seem to really believe that they would be so harsh. Also, the Russians seem to have underestimated the difficulty of military victory. And this has more to do with the Ukrainian side than the US, although the US has also perhaps exceeded Russian expectations in its willingness to provide military assistance to Ukraine. But it's also that Ukraine has fought better and harder than the Russians expected. So could the US have done anything different to deter Russia's invasion? It's not totally clear. The US and NATO certainly could have been more specific about the penalties that they would impose to make it clearer how costly they would be. But on the other hand, it's possible that Putin was just getting bad information. I mean, he seems to have gotten bad information about his likelihood of victory on the battlefield. So it's possible his advisors would have downplayed the sanctions threat, even if it was clearer. But deterrence is not really over, even though the Russian invasion of Ukraine has happened, because now the US is focused on deterring Russian use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, which seems to be a possibility that Putin has hinted at with a few of his public statements. And by the way, I just picked out this cartoon because it echoes this. The bottom cartoon is a famous cartoon from the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the top one is intended to echo that. So to deter Russian nuclear use, the US has continued to make non-specific threats. In fact, these are even less specific than the ones back in February. So Biden has said Russia would be making an incredibly serious mistake. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said Russia would face catastrophic consequences. So this is strong language, but very non-specific. Jake Sullivan has suggested that he conveyed more specific consequences to Russia in private. But a lot of people, well, there's a debate about whether public or private threats is better. Public threats are certainly more costly, and so in terms of costly signaling logic, public threats should be better. On the other hand, there can be concern that public threats can actually sort of provoke the adversary by sort of putting them on the spot. So that could be a reason to use private threats. Ultimately, the US might have rather limited ability to impose punishment because of the level of punishment that is already imposed. So it might be hard to come up with additional sanctions that are significantly more painful. And personally, I think Biden would not take the US into war in the event that, even if even if Russia used nuclear weapons. So that sort of is a limitation on leverage. Also quickly turning to Taiwan. So the China-Taiwan issue has gone on for decades. Under Xi Jinping, it seems to have taken up a little more salience, and particularly the fact that Russia has invaded Ukraine has made people worry that China will sort of imitate this by invading Taiwan. The US has traditionally been ambiguous about its commitment to Taiwan. We used to have an alliance with Taiwan, but ended it under President Ford. And since then, there's been ambiguity. However, recently, the US has been sending clearer signals of support. So Biden has explicitly said that the US would fight to defend Taiwan, which his administration says is not a major change in policy, but I think most observers would say that it is, because the US has never been explicit about this before. Now, this is just a statement by the president. It's not like a treaty. It doesn't carry any legal weight. Also, Congress has been agitating for more US support of Taiwan, and House Speaker Pelosi went to visit there a couple of months ago, making it one of the highest level visits they've ever had. I think there's pros and cons of this. So in terms of deterrence success, so a pro, of course, is greater clarity. We're explicitly saying to Beijing what we would do. That greater clarity also creates greater costs for backing down. So now that Biden said we will defend Taiwan, it would be harder for him not to do it. So that should boost credibility. On the other hand, there could be concern about emboldening Taiwan. So the US sort of walks a fine line. We've discouraged Taiwan from ever actually declaring independence or doing anything else that would provoke mainland China. So the concern is that if we give Taiwan more support, maybe they'll be more emboldened to do provocative things. And then there's also concern that these signals themselves could provoke Beijing. So it's possible when you signal that you not only create costs for yourself for backing down, but also by sort of putting things on the public stage, you create costs for the other side whom you're trying to coerce or deter. So if that's the case, then it's not clear that it's a net benefit. So just to wrap up, if we compare the signals I talked about that were used during the Cold War to what the US is doing today for Ukraine and Taiwan, I would say the signaling today is a lot weaker. There's reluctance to make even specific verbal deterrence threats, especially for Ukraine. Now, this is not necessarily a mistake. I mean, I think it reflects a lesser US interest in Ukraine and Taiwan than the US has in NATO. And if in fact the US interest in these countries is lesser and we're not willing to fight, then it's not necessarily a good idea to pretend that we are willing to fight, because that could damage the US reputation down the road if they kind of call our bluff. But it is important to acknowledge that when we sort of restrain our signaling in this way, it does suggest lower credibility. So that's the end of my slides, and I'd be happy to take questions. I guess, should I stop the share?
Yes, actually, if you could do that, that'd be great. Look, Roseanne, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. You've covered a great deal of ground there. And perhaps while waiting for some questions, and for those of you in the audience.
There's something in the Q&A.
There's something in the Q&A, right. I should also say that if you want to also raise your hand and come in and speak, we can arrange for that as well. Actually, before I get to the one in the Q&A, just sort of a couple of points. sort of in reaction to your presentation that I was sort of thinking about. So just as a sort of point of historical interest, I think when you mentioned the issue of pre-delegated authority in relation to NATO during the Cold War, I think that was only for air defense weapons, as opposed to other weapons. Sort of, as opposed to most other sort of battlefield nuclear weapons. I think it was just on the air side that it was a bit that it was the sort of pre-delegated, but I could be wrong about that.
Okay, no, I think you're probably right. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but I think you're probably right.
Yeah, but regardless, the point about sort of Biden and Taiwan, I was struck recently when I was going through back through some earlier statements from the Eisenhower administration, and especially the August sort of 1958 Taiwan Strait crisis, where the Joint Chiefs of Staff were actually putting together a deterrent message for the People's Republic of China, basically saying don't invade. But in that statement, they mentioned specifically, if you do this, we might use atomic weapons. And one thing that strikes me about so many messages that are sent is that they don't mention atomic weapons or nuclear weapons explicitly at all. They'll use a sort of vague, euphemistic language because there's some sort of, I guess, perhaps some sort of fear of actually using that language, even if that is what they intend to do. But one of the interesting things about why that message was not sent at the time, in addition to not liking the atomic language, was actually that, as you said, they were actually afraid of emboldening their Taiwanese allies. Instead of just deterring the sort of the mainland Chinese, it was also going to be about emboldening Chiang Kai-shek. I think the other thing was in relation to NATO and Ukraine, and you sort of mentioned some of the statements that came out, especially I think in February, but even earlier, I think there have been reports that I think as of the previous October and November, there were private messages and private warnings to Russia. But I was sort of doing some research on the statements that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization made publicly, both the Secretary General as well as various communiques and statements. And if you go back to, say, December, they're talking about massive consequences, and they repeat this again later on in February, about a week or two before the invasion itself. But these are sort of like such vague threats that you don't really know what precisely they have in mind. They never really spell it out. And so I was sort of very interested in this idea that, they keep them that vague. And I was sort of wondering, on the one hand, your opinion, do they do that because they just want to keep it ambiguous for some sort of maybe domestic political reasons or something like this, or is it because they've not actually worked out a policy of what to do if it actually goes wrong?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things going into ambiguity. Yeah, in the case of NATO, I think probably what you said second is the best explanation, because NATO is such it's a large organization. A lot of people have to come together to agree on things. So yeah, I think in the case of NATO, a large part of it is that they didn't really know what they would do. But yeah, there can also be other reasons to just sort of like keep your options open. There's even an argument, and I don't necessarily think this is right, and I think most people don't think it's right, but some people put forward the idea that if you are ambiguous, then you can sort of keep the other side guessing, and maybe they'll like imagine an even more horrible punishment than you would actually carry out. So that could also be a possible strategic reason for ambiguity.
Sure. Well, thanks for that. I've got a few questions lined up, so let me just start. This one's from an anonymous attendee who asks why, similar to the fears relating to China, the US is not deterring Turkey. Despite being a NATO member, Turkey has a casus belli and issues threats against NATO member Greece, illegally occupies North Cyprus, has developed military interventions in Libya, Syria, Iraq, often against US interests, develops nuclear plants, etc. But I guess a lot of different things you could sort of refer to in terms of behavior that the US doesn't like. Why doesn't the US do more to try to deter Turkish behaviors it doesn't like?
I mean, this is not really central to my expertise, but my thinking is the US, I mean, the US is not happy with any of this. And Turkey is also increasingly non-democratic, or in fact, I think a lot of people would say not even a democracy anymore. So none of this makes the US happy, but on the other hand, the US already has plenty of enemies in the region, including Russia and Iran most prominently. Turkey is in a strategic location. So I think the US just doesn't want to make relations with Turkey too bad. And so they're willing to tolerate some behavior that's not really ideal. And Greece and Cyprus are not I mean, they're NATO allies, but they're not like among the closest countries to the US. So the US, I think, is sometimes willing to take more of a neutral stance towards these issues.
I have another question from Kaylee Glenn, who says, the threat of imposing sanctions seems a different deterrent signal than threatening military strike or the sunk cost signals of moving troops. And research finds that threats of sanctions are not successful tools of deterrence. Had the Ukraine-related sanctions actually been imposed under existing sanctions legislation, might that have been a stronger deterrent signal? In other words, can the imposition of sanctions be a signal of deterrence? And she says, to clarify, had the sanctions actually been imposed at the time that the threats were issued? Sorry.
Oh, okay. So if the US had actually imposed the sanctions like before Russia invaded to show we were serious. Yeah, so I think there's a trade-off there. So I mean, the advantage would be it would show that we're serious, we're actually willing to go through with it. On the other hand, if you impose the punishment before the other side actually acts, then in a way you're like removing their incentive for good behavior. Now, I guess we could have said, okay, we're going to impose these sanctions until you so Russian troops are on the border, we impose sanctions. We could have said, okay, we'll take these sanctions off when your troops move away. But then we'd actually sort of be moving into more of compellence instead of deterrence. And compellence tends to be even more difficult. So it's important to have, I guess, like not only a stick, but a carrot, with a carrot being like, we don't punish you if you behave the way we want. And yeah, but I mean, they're correct that there's a lot of doubt over whether sanctions are even effective at all, either as a threat or actually imposing them. There's a lot of debate about this in the literature and quite a bit of skepticism.
We have another question from Adam, who asks, he says, great talk, many thanks. Do you think signaling on deterrence today is weaker than in the Cold War because there are more communication channels available due to newer technologies, so more and different messages can be transmitted?
I mean, I don't think that's the primary reason it's weaker. I think the underlying reason is more that the US is just less resolved over some of these issues than it was during the Cold War. And part of that is the nature of the issues itself. And I think another part of it is like an increasingly isolationist trend in US foreign policy compared to I mean, during the Cold War, there was a pretty strong domestic consensus that the US should basically be the leader of the free world. That consensus is now less strong. But yeah, I do think newer communication channels can be a source of confusion. In fact, I have a paper that talks about the international interaction paper talks about the effectiveness of threats transmitted through different channels, and it finds that like more formal threats tend to be more effective than like less formal off-the-cuff threats. And so I think Twitter is something that can be kind of confusing because it can be very off the cuff. And so I think sometimes recipients of threats over Twitter don't really know what to make of it because they're not really sure, what went into it.
Yes, I can sort of just think back to when Trump was president and all sorts of threatening statements that were made during his time in office on Twitter, which I suspect most of his own officials couldn't really understand what he was saying or what he intended to say.
Yeah.
By the
Sometimes
state.
these were very vague, and like he seemed to be a very spontaneous tweeter. So you're wondering, like, did he really think this through? What does he really mean by this? So yeah, I think that kind of muddied the communication channels.
But I mean, I sort of gather from the Trump period that there was a sense that, at least from a number of countries, at least at first, maybe the first year or so, that what he was doing on Twitter actually was US policy. And therefore they became extremely concerned, at least some countries, that when he was making these statements, that he was actually going to follow through with some of these, or at least I'm not sure if they, anybody went on alert or something like this, but basically that I do remember a number of stories from the time that other countries had actually gotten quite concerned. But sort of on this point, though, before we go on to the next question, again, with some of Biden's statements, there seems to be this tendency, on the one hand, for him to make these statements, like on Taiwan, for example, which he'll say, but you don't quite know if it's a gaffe, and then it's sort of, his own officials will sort of walk it back within a few hours or something like this. So sort of, do you only take it face value, or sort of you only really take seriously those statements that come through certain forms, like not necessarily an offhand statement from the president, but actually something that is, a formal presentation or something that's written down. And sort of one of the reasons I asked this is because I recall back in, I think it was 2012, when Obama made some statement at a press conference about drawing a red line in Syria because of the sort of movement of Syrian chemical weapons units or something like this, or use of chemical weapons in Syria. But it wasn't, I don't think it was a prepared statement per se, it was a response to a question. But nevertheless, that became sort of the red line statement that everybody referred to. Again, clearly a case of deterrence failure, assuming it was intended for that purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I do think the more evidence there is that a statement is carefully prepared, the more effective it will be. For these off-the-cuff statements, I think it's kind of intermediate effectiveness. I mean, I think uncertainty about whether the leader really meant it can weaken the threat, but don't necessarily render it irrelevant. And I think it also matters what happens next. So Obama spoke off the cuff, but if I remember correctly, he did eventually like double down on that threat. So he didn't attempt to walk it back. And also with Biden's statement on Taiwan is even more ambiguous. I mean, it seems like he meant it, because he in the interview he basically said it twice, because first he said it and then the interviewer like asked him to clarify, and he sort of said the same thing again. So it seems like it wasn't just a mistake, but then on the other hand, no one else in his administration has really backed that up. So I think probably it would be more credible if other people in the administration said more clearly, this is the new US policy.
And we have a question from Douglas Shaw, and this sort of goes back to a point you raised earlier. Are there good rules of thumb for the use of ambiguity? What makes ambiguity in deterrence threats better or worse?
Yeah, this is a tough one. I would kind of recommend the work, and I've actually mentioned this to you earlier, Jeff, of Daniel Altman at Georgia State. He has some work on this, because there's some discussion. So you can be ambiguous in like the red line, like what is the inappropriate behavior, or you can also be ambiguous about the punishment. And I think in both cases, ambiguity has some downsides. The downside might be a little bigger in the case of ambiguity about what you can't do, because, well, I feel like you could argue it either way, now that I think about it. I mean, I guess the argument against being really clear is, if you're really clear, like this is the one thing you can't do, then that can allow the other side to like push like right up to that line and do everything else but that. And so according to that argument, if you're ambiguous, then you sort of you can maybe like cover a broader range of things that the other side can't do. On the other hand, if there's something you really, really don't want the other side to do, like invade Ukraine, then you should probably be, clear that that's the thing. And also, if you're ambiguous, it can reduce like audience and reputational costs, which can reduce the overall threat credibility. In terms of the punishment, again, there can be advantages of ambiguity. It can keep people guessing. It can keep your own options open. It can be a good idea. It can be maybe the only option if you don't have a strong consensus. But again, the downside is whenever you weaken the specificity, you tie your hands to a lesser extent, and that can make it less costly and therefore less credible.
A couple more questions for you. In terms of, you've studied this a great deal. I'm just sort of curious, your observations, in terms of the types of threats and in terms of sort of the study of deterrent threats. You have the public warnings, you have the private warnings, you have other types of action that can take place, as you pointed out, military maneuvers or something like this. Is there any pattern to account for the choice of what type of signal you're sending? Do you do these things all at once? Do you do them sequentially? Is sort of the public statement of a president, sort of the final straw? And there are a lot of things that precede that. I'm just curious your observations about that.
Yeah, I guess I have a few thoughts. So one way to sort of break it up is hand tying versus sunk cost signals. And also hand tying signal, there's sort of two ways that they co-vary. So, hand tying signals have a different type of cost than sunk cost, but they also tend to be more public. So the cost is really based on publicity. And so I think there's two types of countries that tend to not get as many public hand tying signals. One is types of countries where the US, where there's an overlap in strategic interests, but there's also sort of like some differences in policy, like say the US and Saudi Arabia. So, right now we're having even strategic differences with Saudi Arabia, but historically we were kind of strategically on the same page, but like our domestic systems are very different, and we even would like criticize each other's domestic systems. And so that's one reason why like countries like Saudi Arabia might not get as public types of signals. And then there might also be less willingness to send hand tying signals for countries like Taiwan or even Israel, where we're concerned about sort of emboldening them to be more provocative. So that's one way to think about it. And then in terms of alliances, like versus statements, I think alliances are good for long-term deterrence. They're the strongest hand tying signal. But because they're like sort of so steady, persisting for decades and decades, I think sometimes it's good to send more personal, like short-term signals in the event of a crisis. And of course, in the case of a country like Ukraine, where there's no alliance, the US would just rely more on the statements.
And again, as someone who looks at these things, what sort of evidence is there that these statements actually, whether private, public, or whatever, that they actually work to deter? I know this is a problem with deterrence research more generally, which is actually, you can sort of tell a deterrence failure because you've told them not to do something and they go ahead and do it. But again, as you mentioned, for example, did the Soviets ever really intend to invade Western Europe? We sort of have a lot less evidence for that. So, was deterrence a success in that case? Well, it's sort of a bit more ambiguous, perhaps even not at all. So I'm just sort of curious, can you think of any historical cases you would cite as being sort of providing good evidence, or that there is some good evidence that these signals, even if they're not so successful, but at least that they're taken seriously by the other side?
I mean, so, well, this is, I mean, I know you guys will talk next week about the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's not, in that case, I would say deterrence failed, but compellence, which is usually a harder problem of getting the other side to change their behavior, actually succeeded. I think, Kennedy's statements weren't the only factor, but I think they were a factor in that crisis. I guess also Berlin crisis. I mean, in that case, I think for most of the Cold War, the Soviets just weren't interested in invading Western Europe. I mean, that's just I can't claim to have read everything in the Soviet archives by any means, but just from what I've read in secondary sources, a little primary, I think from Brezhnev on, they just weren't really interested in that. So I don't think we were really deterring them very much, even though we thought we were. But I mean, Khrushchev really did not like West Berlin being controlled by the West. He made threats about it. I think he wanted to carry them out, but he didn't do it because he believed the US would actually fight him and was willing, and that the US was willing to escalate to the nuclear level. I think Taiwan probably also is it's hard to know, it's hard to say oh, this specific statement deterred China, but I mean, it's pretty clear China wants Taiwan back, and they haven't done it yet. So I think we would probably have to call that a deterrent success.
And sort of as a final question from me, I'm sort of just curious, can you think of any cases where other countries have warned the US and the US has been deterred? So I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Yeah, and that's an interesting question.
Because one thing that I'm always curious about, especially studying the Cold War, is that from the Soviet perspective, or the Warsaw Pact perspective, they might say, well, they actually deterred a NATO attack.
Yeah,
now I'm sure NATO wasn't actually planning to attack into Eastern Europe, but nevertheless, they would say that this was a success of their deterrence. Or more recently, for example, with Ukraine, the Russians would say, well, our nuclear deterrent has prevented sort of NATO from sending actual forces into Ukraine. Or something.
Yeah, I think, and that might be true. I mean, it's hard to know the counterfactual there. I mean, like I said, the US public right now doesn't have a whole lot of appetite for foreign intervention, but I think without the Russian nuclear threat, there would at least be discussion of whether we should be sending troops to Ukraine. But as things are now, there's no serious person who's actually proposing that.
No, I mean, I think there was also some debate about the level of sort of equipment support. So there's a whole debate if you go back about, fighter aircraft and that sort of thing.
Yeah, there's some things that Biden won't send, that the Ukrainians have asked for and Biden won't send. So yeah, I think you could interpret that as being a result of Russian deterrence.
Great. Well, look, as is now 5 p.m., I'm afraid that I will need to bring the session to a close. Rosemary, thank you so much for a superb presentation, which I found very informative and sort of very useful for my own work. And I'm certainly you've given everyone else a great deal to think about, including some of my students who will be dealing with these issues in the coming weeks. Before leaving, I would like to briefly remind everyone that the next session in the series will take place on the 22nd of this month with Professor Mikala Honecker-Moore, who'll be speaking on the varieties of patriotism, how Americans debated their country's role in the world from the good war to Vietnam. So I look forward to seeing you then. And again, thank you very much, Rosemary. And thanks to everyone else.
All right. Thank you very much, Jeff. And thank you everyone in the audience for coming and for your really interesting questions.